Very good. So welcome. My name is Heather Smith, and I'm the Executive Director for Rayjon Share Care. We're delighted that you could join us. We have a very exciting evening or afternoon, depending on where you are today. Rayjon Share Care is based out of the small city of Sarnia, Ontario. And with respect, we honor the long history of the many First Nations people on this land. And we acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe peoples, including the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa. As we gather in this virtual space, we recognize that we're connected with one another through the winds that carry air into our lungs, through the waters that move deep into the earth and up into the sky. We acknowledge that the ground beneath our feet is historically the home of Indigenous peoples, many of whom have been forced to leave for other lands. You are now invited to share with us using the chat feature where you are joining from, and to acknowledge the peoples who were the first to live, celebrate, lament, and sing upon the land where you now sit. May we commit to work together in solidarity towards reconciliation, truth, and understanding as we strive to fulfill our responsibilities and obligations to care for our home, Mother Earth, and all her beings. So a couple of items of housekeeping before we introduce our guest of honor. First of all, I'd like to thank a special Rayjon volunteer, Mr. Gord Walkling, who's busy behind the scenes tonight, making sure that the meeting runs smoothly, providing tech support, and helping to moderate the Q&A. If you are having difficulty with technology, please use the chat feature to send a private message to Gord, and he will try to assist you. A reminder that this is a webinar meeting, and so there are two separate ways to share your thoughts. If you'd like to share a message with the entire group, for example, as we've done with the land acknowledgement, you can use the chat feature. When we get to the Q&A session, please click on the Q&A button to submit your questions. We're also going to be sharing a variety of links throughout the presentations, additional resources for you, but we don't want you to have to worry about following them or saving them immediately. Don't worry, you will receive an email after the presentation with all of those links and resources. Reminder that this meeting is also being recorded, and we hope to make it available to you later. Please remember this space, we are committed to listening to one another, learning from one another, and treating one another with dignity, respect, and care. And comments or behavior outside of those values will not be tolerated. I'd like to also give a shout out to our very special partners who've made this evening possible. First of all, our local fabulous indie bookstore, The Bookkeeper. And if you haven't gone into The Bookkeeper yet to pick up your copy of What Storm, What Thunder, please pop in and see Susan and her team. They'd love to help you out. We also want to acknowledge the Sarnia-Lambton Alliance Against Hate, which is a fabulous new program in the Sarnia-Lambton area, providing support to victims of hate-motivated acts. A SLA, as they're known, is designed to walk alongside individuals who've been targets of hate-motivated acts. They connect, they act, and they engage. Please know that there is an online reporting option so that you can report a hate-motivated crime and receive support in any form necessary. Lots of ways to connect with the SLA, and we actually have Lindsay, the program manager, is here with us tonight. So it's another option for you if you'd like to connect with Lindsay via the chat. And of course, we'll be sending you the links to learn more about the Sarnia-Lambton Alliance Against Hate. You can find them on Facebook and their website through the John Howard Society as well. So thank you, wonderful community partners. Okay, I think we're ready. Now, the moment we've all been waiting for, it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you Dr. Myriam J.A. Chancy. Myriam is a Guggenheim Fellow and HBA Chair of the Humanities at Scripps College. Her most recent novel, What Storm, What Thunder, continues to collect accolades and has been named a Best Book of Fall by Time, The Washington Post, BuzzFeed, The Chicago Tribune, Vulture, Good Housekeeping, Boston.com, Parade, Thrill List, and more. It was shortlisted in the fiction category of the Golden Poppy Awards and is longlisted for the Aspen Words Literary Prize. Her past novels include The Loneliness of Angels, The Scorpion's Claw, and Spirit of Haiti, which was shortlisted in the Best First Book category for Canada Caribbean region of the Commonwealth Prize in 2004. She's authored several academic books, including Framing Silence, Revolutionary Novels by Haitian Women, and From Sugar to Revolution, Women's Visions of Haiti, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. Myriam has served as an editorial advisory board member for PMLA from 2010 to 2012, as a humanities advisor for the Fetzer Institute, and as a 2018 advisor for the John S. Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. Myriam, welcome, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here to share about What Storm, What Thunder with your readers and supporters of Rayjon, really admiring the work that you're doing on behalf of Dominicans of Haitian descent in the Dominican Republic. And what I hope to do today is to share a little bit of information through the novel, which is on the 2010 earthquake. It's a novel told through 10 distinct narrative voices for people of different ages, backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, genders, and to maybe explore with you today a little bit in a sort of a brief way, how the consequences of the earthquake actually reverberate into the present, into migration patterns in Latin America and other parts of the Caribbean, so the Dominican Republic, Latin America, and Central to South America. A lot of people don't realize, I'm going to share my screen, I have some images to share with everyone. A lot of people don't realize that there are many ways in which the earthquake has affected, or the aftermath of the earthquake has really affected, Haitians both inside of Haiti and in the migration. So I'll be talking about the consequences of the earthquake. And I'd like to start through a narrative voice. Her name is Malou, a market woman, who bookends the novel. So she begins and ends the novel. And I want to start there because she, in a very clear way, gives a summary of what the earthquake was like for many people on the ground who had very few means to help others. And I'll begin with a citation from her, which references eggs. And some of you who may have read the novel will have noticed that eggs recur through the novel as a leitmotif. And I'll explain during this presentation why eggs have actually had a lot to do with the pushing back of Haitians coming to the Dominican Republic after the earthquake. So I'll begin with Malou. Yes, yes, Malou. I admit, finally, that these bones of mine are old, worn out, fragile, like the eggs I take to market that everyone wants, even the Dominicans. I never thought I would see the day that Dominicans would want anything we produce for ourselves, but all they really want is to sell us their good-for-nothing eggs produced in factories. My eggs are warm from being dropped from the hens inside. That's how fresh they are. That fresh. And then she goes on to talk about the earthquake moment. I watched. That's what old market women do. We watch. But this time, the lot of us market women sprang to action even as our bones creaked for lack of cartilage and oil, like the others on the street. We used anything in hand we could find, useless things like spoons and forks, the metal ends of umbrellas, as if our puny things, our fingernails, could move all that. Only the lucky were saved. Being lucky meant simply that you were closer to the surface, or that fewer things blocked the way to being found. We heard people on their cell phones all up and down the street, begging frantically for help, giving directions to where they thought they were beneath the rubble, within the rooms of their houses. Phones rang and we heard people answer them, then fewer and fewer voices. The tinny, persistent ringing of cell phone tones, different songs rising like wind from underground with no answer. We heard our own voices screaming at each other, asking for help, not knowing what to do. Faces covered with dust and sweat and other things later to be determined. What to do. There was nothing to do but to scream, try anything, flail our hands, scratch at the earth like my chickens when they get confused because their fresh laid eggs disappear one by one and still they lay more. Try anything And still, it's too late. After the earth rose and split open, yes, I saw angels walking, but there had also been dust, white dust everywhere, caking all objects and every moving thing. The dust came from the concrete crumbling to pieces as buildings flattened, but there were also other things mixed in, blood and bones. Had I mistaken the walking dead for angels, survivors stumbling through the debris with the same white flakes covering their bodies from head to toe that covered mine? Eventually, we, the market women, remembered our oil lamps and lit them one by one, those of us who could. Only part of the market had been crushed, the part against a wall. Still, it was impossible to tell what belonged to whom. And at that point, no one cared. We worked at freeing those we could, said prayers for the others, promising deliverance to those we could not get to give them some solace, some hope in their final moments, because salvation would soon be theirs. Then back down the street, darting back and forth, using the goods from the market to feed those working at rescue, doing what we could as we always did, our large bodies moving through the rubble as if we were land whales, made for swimming through dust-laden air, made for parting human waves. And of course, from that moment on, people, as you see in this image, were living with runes. This is an image I took in Port-au-Prince in 2011, and there were runes everywhere. And so Malou talks about the moment of seeing everything fall down. And I think what I want to talk a little bit about today is, the consequences of living with those runes, with the rubble, with the people who were not found after, and the duress that takes place when people have to live in those conditions. And so we have to remember, and the book is dedicated to the upwards of 250,000 people who perished in the earthquake. The numbers are now at 316,000. The Haitian Times put together the graphic that you're seeing now. And some of the numbers here also incorporate, I think, some of the numbers from the earthquake that occurred in August 2014. I'm losing time, 2021, August 14th, 2021. Until that time, it was reported that about $13 billion went into the country, and now the numbers are at 16.3 billion. And so this also brings up another issue, which is what happened to all the aid that went into Haiti. And another character by the name of Olivier discusses this. He and his wife, Sarah, have lost 2 children in the earthquake instantaneously and are about to lose a third, who is seriously injured, by the name of Jonas, whom you encounter later in the novel. And what Olivier does is he leaves his wife, Sarah, and his remaining child, Jonas, in one camp in order to go to another camp, because part of what happened at this time, so you have to imagine that Port-au-Prince was built for approximately 250,000 people, and at the time of the earthquake had something like 3.3 million people. And so Olivier is trying to figure out what to do. And one of the solutions that were presented to people like him who had survived was decentralization. So going outside of the capital. And from the larger camps, some other camps were created, and he moves to one of the camps where work has been promised in a factory. And in so doing, he's also trying to distance himself from all of the losses that he has encumbered, and he's using his skill as an accountant to try to compute the money that's coming in and what's going to happen to them. With apologies, he does swear a little bit. This is on page 230, if you're following. And says, this is only a few months after the earthquake. It's been less than 3 months, and there's been a mad dash for pledges from what they call the international community. What community there is, I don't know. Millions from Cuba, Venezuela, Brazil, God knows from where, hundreds of millions, thousands of millions, maybe trillions. Unbelievable that it took this, an earthquake, to open the coffers, abracadabra. Imagine if every single Haitian who lost someone could get their hands on some of that money, decide what they needed for themselves, their family. You could create a healthy working middle class, and still there would be millions amassing in a treasure trove behind them. But of course, they won't allow that to happen. They tell us first that we need to learn our lesson. Death by hunger isn't enough. Then that we need to build better infrastructure. Then that we need to unlearn our corrupt ways, stop killing each other, have fewer dreams for our children, because everyone knows that we are a dreamless people. Be good factory workers so that those who are already millionaires can become billionaires, and billionaires can become zillionaires. In short, aspire down, not up. A people who know what to do with nothing will know what to do with plenty, is my thinking. You can be sure of that. I only have to look at all the Madame Sarah, the sides of the roads and in the markets. I know they have a stash somewhere. After they pack up at the end of the day, the vast majority of them have a little cabane to go home to. They lay their heads down. They might even make enough to pay another woman a little something to clean while they're away, send the children to school, and greet the children when they return. Have a pot of bone soup waiting on the stove. Ah, women like Malou, they know how to pinch pennies, spread the wealth. You raised us, paid for our uniforms and school books, dusted us off when we fell, taught us our prayers, taught us how to tell the devil to fuck the hell off when we needed to, because the devil isn't always an enemy. Showed us how to turn pennies into good and good into dollar. Ah, the almighty American dollar. You women know, you taught us. You could turn this whole goddamn place around, bring us into the black, literally, and take no shit while turning the evildoers out of the market. It's simple it's simple math. 2.5 million of us crawling around a maze of streets in a capital made for 250,000. Not enough pipeline to carry all the shit that 2.5 million people can produce on a daily basis. Not enough potable water to service that 2.5 million. Not enough garbage trucks to haul off the refuse that 2.5 million can produce on any given day. Piles and piles accumulating next to the produce being sold at market while everyone is running around doing something, but at least 70% are officially unemployed. The majority of a population under 24 years of age, and at least 50% children or people over 70. An earthquake happens after decades of people wishing that they could blow the whole place up. And don't you know, the whole thing does blow up and we can start again. We will start again. How convenient. There is no other choice. We have to build back better. As the gouverneur, our American benefactor, says, of course, no one knows for sure who this we might be. It doesn't include any of us boiling like groundnuts under corrugated roofs. So this is Olivier pontificating about what could have been done differently. And so I want to bring us back to the question of eggs that I mentioned at the very beginning, and Malou mentioning the eggs and that her eggs are good. And we are talking a little bit today about, assistance. So what assistance did come? It's very true that the Dominican Republic provided immediate relief because they are occupying the eastern side of the island, and also because the landing strip at the airport was closed down by the American military. And so international aid had to come through the Dominican Republic in the initial weeks and months, and then over the mountains into Haiti. There's a report by Foreman and White, as you see on this slide, where they looked at, a year later, what the Dominican Republic had been able to do. And so they opined that the DR had a better infrastructure because of its, and also had proximity, and also had a history of disaster risk management, mostly with hurricanes rather than earthquakes. And they concluded that Haitians should aspire to Dominican prosperity. And what's interesting about that is that very few people know the long history of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, that the Dominican Republic celebrates its independence actually from Haiti, not from Spain, that Haiti liberated both sides of the islands during the revolution in ending slavery, and that the prosperity that Dominicans enjoy today actually came through development that occurred under a Haitian president when the two sides of the islands were united. I don't have time to go through all of the details of why there was such acrimony between the two. Some of it has to do with the colonial histories. But in terms of the 2010 post-earthquake situation, what documents like this one don't reveal is that there were private deals made between Dominican and actually Canadian companies in the purchase of land that were found to be rich with natural resources on the Haitian side at the same time as some of these rescues were taking place. So in the public sphere, rescues were taking place, and on the private sphere, their deals were being made such that Haitians themselves who were afflicted with the earthquake and its consequences had no idea that land that was very rich and could help their prosperity was being sold from beneath them. And this also brings us to the ruling by the Constitutional Tribunal of the Dominican Republic in September of 2013, September 23rd of 2013, and the compelling market-driven that were related. And this is where eggs come in. I just skipped through the slide. So the Martelly government, which was in power at that time in the summer of 2013, refused the importation of Dominican eggs into Haiti in 2013 in favor of domestic production. And this had been going on since 2010 because small landowners, small producers, agriculture, farmers, many of whom had been women until this point, were arguing for the opportunity to feed their own people. And in the very first weeks of the aftermath of the earthquake, it was local producers who were providing for the markets, and they were doing so actually successfully. But in very short order, all kinds of staples, rice, and so forth were being dumped into the marketplace, which drove up the prices of local staples. But there was a movement from, it actually predates 2010, but there was a concerted effort from 2010 to 2013 towards local production and imposing tariffs on what was imported from the outside. An economist by the name of Paul Latortue, who works out of Puerto Rico, is at the University of Puerto Rico, opined that it was this decision by Martelly which changed everything. And it was the turning point for a ruling against migration from Haiti to the Dominican Republic, because he explains, and he's an economist, that in 2010, so if you think of only 2010, the Dominican Republic actually sold 250 times what it purchased from Haiti. So actually Haiti is one of its largest consumers, so it drives its economy indirectly. And the ruling of September 23rd, 2013, however, is retroactive to 1929. And I think somebody from Rayjon will speak about this more, so I won't take very much time on this point. But the reason that it's retroactive to 1929 has to do with the rise of blanqueamiento, or the whitening of the nation in that time under the dictatorship of Rafael Trujillo. And it also has to do with the survey of 1930, which gave more land to the Haitian side than to the Dominican side through the legal system. In the 1930s, there were mass expulsions of sugarcane cutters from both the Dominican Republic and Cuba. And there was a massacre in 1937 ordered by Trujillo to de-whiten this zone. Only half of Dominican Haitians actually work in the bateys today, although 70% are born in them and are Dominican by birth. So what has actually happened is that Dominicans of Haitian descent have been stripped, because many of them are born there, have been stripped of their nationality. And that means that they are de facto stateless. They actually have no rights under international law, which is an important thing to remember. But what drove people to leave Haiti for the DR and other parts of Latin America? Well, this image also I think taking in 2011 or 2012 is one of the reasons. There were massive IDP camps all over Port-au-Prince, Tuléogane, in parts of Jacmel. You know, if you had looked at Google Maps at this period in time, you would see it. There were massive amounts of blue everywhere, blue tarps everywhere. So the conditions of life were quite extreme. And I wanted to read two short passages from the novel that speak to this and just the difficulties of camp life. The first excerpt is by Sarah. And Sarah is the wife of Olivier that I just read from, who has lost two of her children and is about to lose a third. And so Olivier is gone. And she says, where was Olivier? Everything made her angry, deep down, an anger she could not show. Her rage manifested itself in a refusal to conform to camp life, the lining up for rice delivery. The rice was meted out by plastic cupful from fat white burlap-like bags emblazoned with the red, white, and blue of the American flag. Scrawny children who seemed to belong to no one moved through the sinew of legs with eyes trained to the ground, picking up fallen grains into the palms of their hands. The lining up for water when the big truck with a rounded back came trundling down the broken cement, spilling half of its contents along the way and more when it stopped to open the faucets installed at the back before anyone was ready to fill their ramshackle containers, ranging from small chipped china cups to emptied coffee cans to multicolored Tupperware to, at the beginning, the large translucent containers designed for hauling water from distant wells, but some had had the foresight of toting with them rather than attempting to save photographs and whatever trinkets they held dear that meant nothing at all to anyone else on earth. The lining up to take a piss in the trenches dug out along the extremities of the camp by men who spoke a language no one could understand, though some looked like them, dark of skin and gaunt, as if they came up from a place where food was also scarce. The lining up, and now the pawing at night. Why had the ground opened up and swallowed them whole, only to leave her alone walking the broken roads? And at the end of that passage, she's reflecting not only at the insecurity in the camps, but also there's an oblique reference to UN soldiers who dumped feces in the Artibonite River, which is the largest river in Haiti, and the feces had cholera, and cholera had been wiped out for, I think, at least 100 years, 50 to 100 years in Haiti. It was reintroduced this way. I think at least 1 million people were infected, at least 1,000 died, and this was just a few months out from the earthquake. The UN has never completely taken responsibility for this, but through the legal system, they are providing restitution to survivors of that, or families who lost family members to the cholera epidemic. And so the next section I'd like to read from is from Tafia, and so there are 3 family groups that are represented with the 10 characters of the novel. And Tafia is in one of the family groups. You also hear from her older brother, Didier, who is not exactly in exile, but a migrant to the United States. You hear from her older sister, Sonia, and Sonia's best friend, Dieudonné. And Sonia is a sex worker. And you hear also about her older brother, but a younger brother named Paul, so younger to Didier. And Tafia is 15 years old, just like any 15-year-old anywhere else, where she is just trying to figure out her life, who will be her best friend at school, who she might date, and then the earthquake happens. And she ends up in an IDP camp. At least 1.5 million people ended up in these camps, internally displaced people camps, which reduced people to a state of refugeeism within their own countries, and is another form of statelessness, I would say. And one of the things I observed, visiting the camps myself after the earthquake and just, seeing how people were living without potable water was the dignity with which people comported themselves. And as the image that you see now shows, and this is what Tafia is also learning in the camps. And so just a brief section here. She says, Sunday, we sorted the wash for Monday and put our few things in order by our beds, on stools or little stands, if we had managed to find or make some. Then the women went to mass, either to the churches in their old neighborhoods, if they were still standing, or right there in the camp, if there was a priest or pastor, or even a Ougan, a healer, willing to hold a service. If they went back to their neighborhoods, it could be a long journey, but they were also glad because they were getting out of the squalor of the tent city for a while, even if it was back to the areas where there was nothing left to look at. Those were days for dreaming and hoping and giving thanks for what was left, if you had it in you. The remainder of Sunday was for rest and drawing up plans for the next week. Other tent cities probably worked differently, and within them, there must have been variations. But I trusted the elderly women because they had lived long enough to have gray on their heads. To me, this was an achievement as significant as getting a high school diploma, or as Didier, her brother, had done, having the faith to move to another country to start over. Getting old couldn't be a matter of simple luck. I'll end the passage that I wanted to read from there just so I can get a little more information out before I run out of time. And I also wanted to read a little bit from Didier's section, or how his section ends, because it reflects on this idea of community and even how we, should be involved outside of this story, which is also true to life. And so, the conditions in the camps, the loss of life, people losing their family members, losing their homes, living in IDP camps. Until last year, until the last earthquake, there were still 50,000 people living in IDP camps, unsheltered in Haiti. And now there are 200,000 people, counting those who are still without shelter and who are food insecure since the 2021 summer earthquake. And so what happened since, the reconstruction did not occur, all those billions of dollars that went in mostly into the tourist industry and went in and came right back out, is that people started leaving initially by invitation. So places like Brazil, Chile, Venezuela, either provided gateways for entry into their countries. So for example, the president of Chile allowed for tourist visas that could be turned into work visas. Other countries like Brazil actually offered humanitarian visas. And so as you see in this map, you saw people leaving for the DR and then going to places like Ecuador, finding their way to Brazil, or going directly to Brazil and then making their way out. Part of what happened during this time is that there was a lot of change. Some countries like Chile experienced their own earthquake in 2010. There was a recession in Brazil in 2015. Basically around 2012, 2013, the tide turned against Haitians. And we see this expressly with the Dominican Tribunal's decision to depatriate or denationalize Dominicans of Haitian descent. But these patterns, so this is a simplified pattern. This was a story by Will Grant in the BBC News, showing how just one person went through 11 countries to find himself on the US-Mexico border in September. Upwards now of 14,000 Haitians have been deported from the US-Mexico border through different avenues. I won't go through this, as I've actually summarized some of this already, but just to end with the point that anti-immigrant sentiment, racialization, recessions, and then the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic also conspired to force Haitian migrants to move from one nation state to another. But I'd like to end with the reflection by Didier at the end of his section, where he talks about what it means to be a migrant elsewhere. And he's a cab driver. I'm going to skip over this just in the interest of time, because I wanted to highlight the fact there are so many Haitians in other parts of the world, in Canada, in the United States, in Brazil. The diaspora is quite large, and it accounts for a large part of the GDP of the country. And so we have to think about what Haitians elsewhere are also bringing back into the country. This is what Didier thinks at the end. He says, one of the things I've learned from driving the cab is that there is no such thing as community. Collectives are fabrications. Collective memory can also depend on which side you find yourself on. I'm sure we can't find a place on earth without its battle scars, its traces of human blood. Grenadians remember the execution of Maurice Bishop, followed by the day the Americans landed on their beaches. Imagine if you were one of the Black soldiers descending on the beach to occupy, then imagine being the Black person staring incredulously back at them. The point of view is just not the same. Jamaicans still mourn Marley, though he was in a battle with himself, far away from any holy land when he died. In Boston, which is where he lives, they like to talk about the time the colonists poured the tea into the bay to protest attacks. They were letting Britain know that they were a free people. I'm sure some heads got broken over that. Today, the pole in Antarctica has become a lake falling from global warming. In Tibet, monks and nuns are setting themselves on fire to send smoke signals, trying to get us to look at what China is doing to their people. But we all look away unless it's us or someone we love going up in flames. You don't know what collective you belong to until your own house is on fire. So I think I'll end there, perhaps with a reflection on what would we do if we were living amongst ruins, and how the migrant experience is really a reflection of a desire to have a life of dignity that perhaps one can't have at home. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Myriam. That was fabulous. I am sure that folks are just percolating with questions. I would like to ask everyone to start pumping those into the Q&A for us. We hope to have a fabulous further discussion with Myriam in a few more minutes here. And just before we launch into our moderated Q&A session, we have one more special guest to introduce to you as you're preparing your questions. So this is Allison Kingston joining us tonight. Allison comes from the smaller town of Corunna, Ontario, just outside of Sarnia. She's currently a student at Carleton University, where she's pursuing her master's in migration and diaspora studies. The focus of her thesis research is on statelessness, focusing on women of Haitian descent in the Dominican Republic. She's a newer Rayjon volunteer who's passionate about partnership abroad. Welcome, Allison, and please go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you so much for that, Heather. So tonight I'm just going to mostly speak about the impact of statelessness. I mean, Myriam did a great job outlining the current situation, but I also kind of want to bring up and discuss what Rayjon is doing to support addressing the concerns of documentation, specifically for those of Haitian descent, Dominicans of Haitian descent. So first, what is statelessness? So statelessness' legal definition is a person who's not considered as national by any state under the operation of its law. This means that a stateless person does not have a nationality of any country. Some people are born stateless, and especially in the case in the Dominican, others become stateless. The majority of stateless people in the Dominican were born in the Dominican itself, and they've lived there their entire lives. So the results of being statelessness often means a lack of access to healthcare, education, or access to the workforce. So healthcare workers also often refuse service to those who are undocumented. Even when they may access services, there's often this risk of deportation as well. Children are often turned away from school registration without citizenship proof, and many are also turned away from writing their national exams that are needed to graduate. Access to the legal workforce is also not possible to most undocumented people, and this can result in low-wage labor, labor exploitation, and working piecemeal jobs in the informal sector, or no access to livelihoods at all. So being without documentation can also result in arbitrary arrests, deportation, and other state violence. So in the Dominican Republic, as Myriam mentioned, in 2013, there was a legal change that deprived hundreds of thousands of Dominicans of Haitian descent of their Dominican nationality covering the period between 1929 to 2010, leaving them stateless. This means that if a person was deemed by the Dominican government to be of Haitian descent, and they were unable to prove that their ancestors had arrived at the Dominican in a documented way, keep in mind there's also been decades of the Dominican reclassifying what's considered proper documentation. Going all the way back to 1929, they lost their Dominican citizenship. And of course, because of those who were born in the Dominican, a lot of them were not eligible for Haitian citizenship either, which resulted in an estimated 200,000 people remaining stateless in the Dominican Republic. So the places that Rayjon is working right now when it comes to documentation is a small community called Barrio 41. So our current documentation project is in Barrio 41 near Consuelo, which is in the east of the Dominican Republic, about halfway between the capital of Santo Domingo and Punta Cana, which I know a lot of Canadians see as a vacation destination. So through this documentation project, we're working with Escala. So Escala is an organization located in Consuelo, which Rayjon has a strong connection with. Escala has a highly qualified legal team who has specialized in assisting Dominicans of Haitian descent with obtaining their documentation, but is also involved in advocacy. So they actively pursue documentation and advocate for the rights of those of Haitian descent in the Dominican, as well as support healthcare access to those who have been denied due to financial or documentation barriers. Excuse me. So the documentation project is supporting Barrio 41 as mentioned, and Escala provides legal aid, financial resources, technology access, all throughout the process of documentation, and supports stateless people through the bureaucratic and judicial process to become officially documented within the state. These processes themselves are often constantly changing, as well as bureaucratic barriers are constantly reinstituted, creating new barriers and more time constraints that further affect those who require documentation. But each case is different and they each have their own individual barriers. So often things as small as spelling mistakes by government officials on historic documents can lead to denial and the process having to be restarted from scratch. Of course, many stateless people may not have access to their parents or grandparents, or even in some cases, great-grandparents' documentation to prove this lineage, which is an additional barrier. Those documents need to be found, acquired, or corrected before the process can even begin, which clearly is often not feasible. Many times there's also financial barriers in accessing documents, and even the financial barriers in traveling from the barrio to government offices are often very high. But Escala and their support staff really works with individuals to overcome these barriers and receive documentation. It's also important to note that women have additional barriers. So often letters from employers are needed to acquire documentation, but most women work in the informal sector, such as housekeeping or small-scale vendors. So they're not able to acquire letters in some cases for some forms of documentation. And for children, even when paternity is never in question, mothers are often burdened with obtaining costly paternity proof to register their children. There's also been an increase in police targeting of pregnant women and mothers of young children with risk of deportation when they're accessing healthcare services. So this often leads to untreated health conditions, putting them and their children's lives at risk. However, we have seen some successes and some positive notes through the documentation project. So the first family I want to introduce you to is the Vincents. So here's their photo. This is Maria Elena Vincent and Andre Bueno Vincent. So Mary Elena Vincent Marte has 3 children who are currently supported in different processes of obtaining documentation. So the oldest Marcia Elena Bueno Vincent is 20 years old, and she recently gave birth to a son, and she's currently going through the judicial process, pending a DNA test to resolve errors in her birth certificate that prevent her from being able to attend a personal and electoral identity card. So then she can afterwards declare her newborn son's birth. So the second of the children is Miguel Angel Bueno Vincent, who is currently being accompanied accompanied in the judicial process to rectify the data on his birth certificate. And he was recently informed by the Superior Electoral Court that his case has had a final judgment, but he still must wait to complete the bureaucratic process before obtaining his documentation. And the last child is Andre, who is in the photo. And he's currently undergoing the late declaration process, which is being investigated in the late statements unit. And despite our insistence, the investigation, and Escala's assistance as well, the investigation has not taken place, nor the interview. So as you can see, the process is constantly running into new barriers, different barriers, but we are making headway and we're growing the program as well. So there's currently 45 families being assisted. So 8 of these cases are fully resolved. 12 of the families' cases have severe barriers, and the other 25 are in progress. So there's also a severe demand for documentation in the community because, as mentioned earlier, not having documents means poor health outcomes, lack of education, and not being able to access formal employment. However, even the ability to reacquire citizenship means the potential reversal of these negative life impacts. So we have plans to expand through 2022 and 2023, including offering assistance to an additional 15 or more families, particularly with obtaining passports, as this has been an urgent request from the community. But we're always looking to expand and support even more families as the need is there. So thank you so much for your time tonight and for your support of Rayjon. But since this problem is massive and cannot be fully covered in these last few minutes, Gord has dropped a few links in the chat with some additional resources to learn more. Like introduce, my whole thesis is just on a small part of the situation. So you can imagine how large, how much content is out there to learn more about it as well. And of course, any donations tonight will support our ability to sustain and expand the documentation project in partnership with Escala. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Allison. That was great. And please do be sure to check out all of those resources to learn more about the situation of statelessness. And again, a reminder that you'll receive an email copy of those links and resources too. So let's jump into our Q&A. I can see that questions are starting to arrive in the Q&A box. Please remember to submit them so we can have a peek and try and get as many questions answered as possible. So Myriam, I'm wondering, to start us off, could we ask you first to share a little bit about how you came to write What Storm, What Thunder?
Yeah, sure. So most people know me as an academic. I write novels and I write literary criticism. And I wrote a book on Haitian women's literature. It's the only book on Haitian women's literature, which was published in 1997, which will date me. But there hasn't been a new one since. But it was, basically to say that by 2010, most people knew me as an authority on Haitian women's issues. And so I was requested for a lot of talks on best practices post-earthquake for mostly non-Haitians, both in terms of what do we do on the ground to help women's groups. And many people, this is referred to in the novel in Anne's section, who's an architect, where she references the fact that the heads of feminist organizations perished in the earthquake. And this, my novel is fiction, but there's a lot of facts in it. This is actually true. All of the largest women's organizations were led by women who perished in the earthquake. Some just happened to be there. Some had relocated. One was from Canada, actually. And they were all Haitian, but they all perished. And so I spent many years, very intense first 6 months after the earthquake, giving talks, but then about 3 years giving talks on best practices. And every time I gave those talks, survivors or people who had lost, family members or colleagues in Haiti would come and commiserate with me. And, it took me until 2013 to realize that people had been doing that because they saw me as a writer first, and that they assumed that at some point I would write on the earthquake. And up until that point, it hadn't even occurred to me. And so when I started working on the novel, I also was in touch with creative artists, painters, in Haiti, but also in Trinidad, where I'd spent some time, who were working on Haiti, who were reflecting on what did the post-earthquake situation mean to them, in terms of solidarity, in terms of, progress for people of Haitian descent. And then I realized that I had so much accumulated knowledge as someone born in Haiti, but also as a Haitian scholar and as someone who had been working on these issues right after the earthquake in an intense kind of way, connecting people to resources within Haiti, sometimes outside of Haiti, especially in the United States. And then I just started working on the novel. It took many years. It took 7 years. And then, it took, 10 years to come out. But I'm glad I did it in the end. But that's why I did it. And also because I realized that fiction has a way of affecting the reader in a way that is very different from the academic presentation or brief. It gives you time to reflect. It allows you to reach into an area of sympathy or empathy that maybe just the numbers cannot do. Because one of the things I realized when I started working on the novel, many people did not remember that an earthquake had occurred just south of, the continent. They didn't recall that the death toll was so massive, and they didn't understand, that there had been no real recovery. I mean, still today in 2022, there are still people, suffering from the aftermath of the earthquake, whether it's because of the losses they suffered, which, if you've lost your child or someone in your family, sometimes these are not things you can heal from. Which is reflected in some of the storylines in the novel. I really wanted to get at that some people persist while others are altered in ways that can never be fully recovered.
Yeah, that's something I actually really appreciated about the novel. There wasn't this perfect happy ending for every character. Each storyline took a very, very different path. So the novel it's a collection of linked stories, right? Each told from the perspective of a different character. Is there 10 in total? Is that the right number?
There are 10 chapters, 10. But 2 are in the voice of Malou. And I think some people see them as linked stories. I didn't write them in that way. I didn't think, because I'm a very bad short story writer. So I think it's interesting that some people read them that way. But I organize the structure of the novel in that way. I think people would conventionally think of, you have one voice and then you dip into another, you go back and forth. And I wanted the reader to experience the kind of radical break that most Haitians, even if they were outside of Haiti, experienced. For most Haitians, even for myself, there is a kind of pre-2010 and a post-2010 period for our lives. And so I wanted those chapter breaks to have that effect on the reader, this feeling that something has been broken. And then you enter another story that's related to the other one, but is different in some way. Because I also wanted the reader to experience the fact, because when we talk about cataclysms, we think in these masses, all the Haitians, they went through this. We don't think in terms of collectives or families or communities or individuals within them. And I wanted the reader to experience this kind of breakage and the kind of isolated way in which everyone experienced the same, catastrophe.
Right. So this evening you started with a passage from Malou. So can you tell us a bit more about that particular character and why it was important for you to tell her story?
Yeah, so my mother's grandmother was a market woman. She was not alive when I was born, but I always heard about her strength and the ways in which she really created the future, a possibility for the future for for her child, which was my grandmother, and then my mother's generation. And it's interesting that women like market women are often discounted. So post-earthquake, I used to give talks on the imagery of the journalistic imagery of the post-earthquake period. And you see that there are a lot of images of either market women going through the debris or women with large, loads on their heads. And though it can bring up this idea of dignity, people persevering in the aftermath, it also, gives us this idea that people can shoulder these burdens. But at the same time, I never saw an interview with any market woman, with any, poor person, because even though, the death toll and the damage went through different classes of people, it is very clear that there were more extreme losses for people who were poor, who did not have dwellings that were earthquake proof, for example. It's just not the same kind of loss. And so I thought, a market woman should have a kind of authoritative voice in this novel, because the market women, if you go to Haiti or Jamaica, anywhere in the world, really, you talk to the market women, they can explain global, economic politics to you, because it affects them directly. It affects their stall and whoever else they employ very directly. They know what's going on. And so I wanted to reflect the wisdom of such a woman, and also that, women like Malou should not be disregarded. And, incidentally, she's the mother of another character in the novel who doesn't acknowledge her, or whose name is Richard, who's a multimillionaire, who, has become French. So he's a migrant of a different kind. He's emigrated to France. He's made a lot of money in the water business and returns to Haiti to sell water, to the poor. And what's interesting for me is that he doesn't acknowledge that he's learned everything from his mother. That his marketing ability, the wealth that he's made, comes from the fact that he comes from a woman who knows how to make a lot out of nothing. Like Olivier says.
Right. The novel has quite a lot of Creole Haitian, Haitian Creole through it. First page in the opening, a traditional begins Malou's perspective, and there are Creole words for which perhaps there may not be a great English equivalent. There are many words and phrases that I think you didn't have to include in Creole, but you did. So I'm wondering, can you tell us a bit about why you chose to do that? Why was it important to you, and what did you hope the reader would gain?
Well, I'll start with the end of your question. I hope that the reader would be reminded that they are encountering characters who are living and thinking and dreaming in Creole. That even though I write in English, which is my second language, but I write in English, and I'm, being encountered by an Anglophone public, that when they're encountering their characters, they're thinking, this character speaks French, this character speaks Creole, or I'm really in Haiti. This may be accessible to me, but I'm elsewhere. And I think some readers have also noticed that the English is not quite English. I don't know if you've noticed that too, but I have a way of writing English, which is quite French, but sometimes a little Creolized, because I've had people translate my work and then realize that the sentence structures are very Francophone. And part of that is to give you that taste of another world. In terms of translation, what I try to do is give you contextualized translations. And I know some readers are irked by not having like a glossary, but part of it is that we should do a little work to encounter others unlike ourselves. When you encounter someone from another country that you want to be friends with, or you fall in love with, the first thing you do is you learn their language. And so I think part of a process of reading this novel is deciding, okay, I'm going to do a little bit of work. I actually do some of the work for the reader, but sometimes people are not aware of it. But because all of the translations are embedded, but sometimes they're not right next to the word. It might be in the next sentence. It might be in the next paragraph. And so you discover that what the meaning of that word might be, or you encountered it very early. So for example, when I read from Olivier, and he's telling us that people like Malou, turn goods into dollars, you actually encountered both of those words in the, in Malou's opening, where Malou explained that goods were the local currency and that dollar was the American dollar. He does say the American dollar with, the almighty American dollar. So you're reminded, okay, I already saw dollar somewhere else. But that's why I wanted to give people a flavor of Haiti, that they're encountering people on their home ground, and to do a little bit of work to meet them, halfway.
And I can tell you, for me personally, that really was more of an immersive experience. I really did find it helped me dive deeper into the lives of those characters. So I'm glad you included it. Thank you for that.
That's great.
We've got some great questions coming up in the Q&A. So I have one more for you, and then we're going to dive right into those. So can you tell us, how does your more research book, so From Sugar to Revolution, how does that fit in with your other academic and creative work, and what motivated that research?
Yeah, so what's interesting is that I often work on two books at the same time. I'm trying to remember the order of these books. Um, From Sugar to Revolution was a parallel book to the previous novel, which was called The Loneliness of Angels. So the history of From Sugar to Revolution is that I started on that work in the 2000s, and I'm actually a quarter Dominican. So my mother's father, so this will be a little bit different from most histories. My mother's father is Haitian of Dominican descent. So exactly the reverse of what we're talking about today. And so I had a very, an upbringing with a very positive sense of relationships between Dominicans and Haitians. And around 2000, and probably Allison knows this, there was a kind of shift going on in terms of a politics between Haitians and Dominicans. So if you look at the long history of how Dominicans of Haitian descent in the DR have been treated, you can look at statues going back to the 80s, which I only discovered doing some of this research progressively moving towards this denationalization that occurs in 2013, where the argument in 2013 is there are too many people coming from Haiti because of a lack of rebuilding and so forth, but that history is just very long. So around the 2000 mark, I had been doing I was asked for a lot of talks again on what's going on between the DR and Haiti. And I started doing this research through the literature because that's my field. And I was noticing that there was a gap between what was happening on the island and what was happening in the literary output by Dominican, Cuban, and Haitian writers reflecting on these relationships. And I did spend a little bit of time in Cuba at that time, and the relationship between Haiti and Cuba is very different. It's very positive, which is partly part of the discourse of the Cuban Revolution, which is that they wanted to, in some ways, have a revolution that was akin to the Haitian Revolution, but in the 20th century. So, and then they also, the discourse of revolutionary Cuba was that it was an Afro country, an African descended country, not a Europeanized country, which was the opposite in the evolution of the Dominican Republic, where steadily, as they declared their independence from Haiti, because it was in 1848, started emphasizing being more European rather than of African descent. And this was, for politics, it was for global trade, it was for a lot of access to things on the national level. And so, what I encountered in the literature was a kind of friction. And so I'm sorry, I'm just becoming professorial, but when you look at Caribbean literature, there's a tradition of trying to revise or rewrite history because our history is not in the official records, to try to write into our novels some part of a history that is nowhere to be found. And so another gap that I found, so if on the one hand, Haitian, Dominican, and Cuban, mostly American writers were not anti-Black in their work, they sometimes had very nationalized ideas about what actually happened between their countries. And so my effort was to try to look at each of these discourses and try to unite them. What's interesting is that I put that book, I actually left academia for a little while, and I put the manuscript aside and then came back to it around 2008. And I was asked to sort of update it, and I was, was kind of meandering with it. And then the earthquake happened, and I had a contract for the book previous to the earthquake. And I thought, how do I make this relevant now? And all of this anti-Haitian sentiment started emerging from the US, from the DR. And I suddenly had a way to reframe the study to say, this is important because things are happening right now on the ground that we need to combat in some way, and see that the literary output is doing some effort to do that at the same time as there was a shift away from historicizing events that, which has something to do with being in America, people getting MFAs and the literature developing aesthetically in ways that are not necessarily about reintroducing historical moments into the novel. And so there's a kind of tension there. But that's why I did the work. I completed the revisions and brought out the book. And surprisingly, it's been a book that has done very well compared to my other academic works. I think because people still do not understand what the tensions are between Haiti and the DR. And as you know, I started this response by saying I'm a quarter Dominican. I think the difference in my work is that because I've always known that I was part Dominican, I understand both a discourse that predates this anti-Haitianism and one that is still hounding us, today. And I'm trying to, in some ways, reveal that there's so much more going on between these two countries. And we need to really be attentive to what is happening and why it's happening.
Yeah,
sorry for that very long answer.
No, that's great. Actually, talking about the tensions between the two countries, I think leads into an audience question here, though I'm curious how you're going to answer this one briefly. It's a big question.
I'll be more succinct.
No, it's all good. So we have an audience member who would like a little more information why the Dominican Republic reclassified Dominicans of Haitian descent, and asks, is it simply to avail themselves of the expense of supporting people who identify as Dominican?
So I would say no to the end of that question, because the vast majority of there are Haitian Dominicans of Haitian descent at different class levels in the Dominican Republic, and but there are large numbers who work in menial labor. And that means that they're actually producing a lot for the country. They're cutting the cane, which is for the rum industry or sugar. They're the ones who are, running stalls. They're the ones who are working in construction. And they're not paid well because they're often undocumented in the sense that, as Rayjon is saying, you're working at producing paperwork, not only to renationalize them, but also so that they can work. Because in the DR, which is true in a number of Latin American countries, you need special documentation, which is different, so in our country, in Canada and the United States, sometimes you need a driver's license to be able to apply for a position or something like that. There you need a cedula, and you need a few other things. It's quite complex, and I'm not going to explain it well right now. But what that means is that people can be taken advantage of and exploited. So it's not a context in which people are receiving funds from the government, as it might be in other countries where you get refugee status and are able to get funds or even healthcare. That is not the case. What I could say, another way to answer the question, I tried to answer it a little bit in terms of the economic issue of the Haitian government deciding that they wanted to import less from the Dominican Republic. And some economists believe that this was a response, economic response. Well, we're going to expulse these Haitians, so to force the government to import goods, which actually did happen. At the level of goods that are fabricated inside of Haiti, that is still happening. But there's still an effort to produce local milk, local rice, local eggs, but they were not able to shift away from Dominican importations. The other reason that's given, which is more complex, but I'll try to be very brief, is that they were in an election cycle when this happened. And there were enough Dominicans of Haitian descent who were in the middle classes working to middle classes with proper documentation that could have voted in the next election cycle, which I think was the following year. Correct me if I'm wrong. And so doing this at the moment that they did it ensured that a large number of people could not vote in the upcoming election. I don't recall if there was a candidate who was either darker of skin or who was of part Haitian descent, but often they have tried to find ways to block Dominicans of Haitian descent or darker skinned Dominicans from being able to exercise their voting rights. And so this was part of what was happening. And it was successful in the sense that, and it wasn't just the poor, Dominican of Haitian descent who were denationalized. There were people who were working to middle class who were denationalized. And this does have to do not only with whether you have proper documentation, but whether the government holds your papers, because there are a lot of legal cases pending and others resolved where it's been demonstrated that the Dominican government destroys, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates that actually demonstrate that people were born in the DR and have rights as people in the United States do because they were simply born there. Because to be a Haitian citizen, you actually have to register your child at the consulate, at the Haitian consulate. But in the DR, if you're born there, unless you know that you want your child to be Haitian, you don't need to do that. Just birth means that you're a citizen, as is the case in the US. So there's a lot of compelling reasons, but the broader issue does have to do with this long legacy of whitening, of wanting the DR, the national discourse being that we are a European Spanish country, and wanting to get rid of as many Black citizens as possible. And so in the DR, if somebody is darker skinned, they're often, quote unquote, accused of being Haitian. And this is a way, this can derail their lives, and so there's no real parallel. I think for Canada, to be honest, the only parallel might be, the ways in which Indigenous people are often divested of their rights, whether of citizenship or land or, other claims that they have as First Peoples. It's not quite the same because obviously, there are also Indigenous groups in Hispaniola, but often Indigenous groups in Hispaniola are Africans. It's hard to explain, but there's a kind of divestment from being of African descent and an encouragement of claiming to be Indigenous to get certain claims, just to get certain rights. And so it's more complicated. So I could refer you to From Sugar to Revolution. Two parts of a book are on these issues, explaining the long history and also the misnomers around, Haitians going to the DR and quote unquote taking advantage of the Dominican Republic. And I'll just end on this one point, which is that, a lot of Haitians would go to the DR to be cane cutters, but until very recent history, they would return to Haiti. And that's something that a lot of people don't know. And the reason they would return is because since the revolution, which happened in 1804, even peasants had their own land in Haiti. So they might be poor, but they had their own land, they had their little cabane, their little home. They would go to work in the DR to cut cane, make some money, and then they would go back. And then the practice, this was, I think, in the late 1800s into the early 20th century, is that the DR started preventing them from returning. And this is still the case, where a lot of Haitians who have migrated over are basically held captive in the bateys and can't return. And so this brings me full circle to the beginning of my answer, which has to do with exploiting people for their labor. This is really about political power, making sure they have no political power.
Thank you for that, Myriam. You helped us to understand some of the complexities and all of the different challenges and barriers that families of Haitian descent face, but also I appreciate that you didn't shy away from summarizing and pointing out the overt racism that's occurred historically and continues to occur. I'm going to take a question now from Christopher, who is joining us from Belize. And I'll just read his question so everyone can hear. He says, "Good evening. Thank you, Dr. Chancy and hosts, for this opportunity. My class in Belize is reading your book now. That passage of Didier's you ended with seems so significant for us interested in the uses of literature for Anthropocene. In our initial discussion, we registered the critiques of possibility of community, a cynical view of humanitarian agencies and disaster NGOs present elsewhere. For example, Amy Willance's Farewell Fred Voodoo, who writes of the Loups-Garoux or parasitic profiteers too. But we felt that your book, in creating its own readership, initiates us into a kind of community of those who might now feel something of loss. This might translate into empathy and perhaps a collectivity of sorts in the future. Is this a kind of literary activism on your part, one of the objectives you had in writing the book?
I would say yes. I can be short in this answer. I would say yes to Christopher, because I'm a writer first, but even my academic works are acts of activism, because they usually come about as a result of realizing there's something I can do or I can say, and that writing is my medium to do it. I think, with this particular novel, I just really wanted people to feel how devastating this earthquake has been. And we had the second one last August. And, I recall that in 2010, there was a conversation about how the seismic plates, run, underneath the Florida Panhandle right up, the eastern seaboard. So under all of the Caribbean, but also up the continent. And that people should be prepared for, in time for these rifts, beneath the surface of the earth to really affect more people than just people on small islands. And so part of the effort was to make people really think about that. What are the consequences of just thinking this is a small place where people are not ready? Are we ready where we are? When the earthquake happened, I was living in a city that had a population of 250,000 people. And often people didn't understand why I was afflicted really with the grief of it in the first months. And I remember walking through the streets of this town, Cincinnati, thinking, what would happen if this town disappeared? Everybody here disappeared and everything was in ruins. How would people respond? I don't think we're ready. And so to imagine that in a country where there's even less readiness, people still had to feel their way through the catastrophe. This is what I try to work through in the novel, because people are still working through these consequences on emotional levels, material levels, political levels. And just in terms of political activism, I was just reading the foreword to Toni Morrison's Sula. She wrote a new foreword to it. And she was talking about how Black authors are often told that they can't get out of this bind, that either their work is political or is apolitical, but it's always, you should be, and she was saying, well, it's art at the service of something. And so, yeah, so I think I am doing that.
And Myriam, we're getting several questions about funding post-earthquake. So I'm going to try and lump a couple of these together, but could you maybe comment on the apparent gap between funds that were donated to Haiti post-earthquake and the funds received or accounted for?
Yeah, because it's a very low number. And often, people will ask me or will comment on, well, isn't the Haitian government irresponsible and, the money shouldn't have gone to them. And the fact is that of the 13 billion that was accounted for, in 2020, 2021, less than 1% went to the Haitian government. I also know scholars who worked in the camps and who reported that all of the IDP camps that were run by the local governments were much more effective in responding to the needs of a local population than those that were run by foreign NGOs. So one of the things that we have to think about, and this is partly why there's a connection to Rwanda in this novel, because I had my parallel work to this book was my last academic book, which has a chapter on representations of Rwanda because of Raoul Peck's film, Haitian filmmaker's film on Rwanda. And just as a side note, one of the reasons I was compelled by that film is because I detected that his understanding of the conflict between the Hutu and the Tutsi was stemmed in some way in his understanding of the conflict between Haitians and Dominicans, which I did talk to him about. And he said it wasn't a conscious reference, but that he thinks it's probably true. And so I did visit Rwanda too during this period. And one of the things I learned from Rwandan scholars, some of whom had been children during the 1994 genocide. And by the way, I think today or yesterday was the anniversary of the genocide. So worth mentioning. What I learned from them was exactly what happened in Haiti in 2010, but this kind of the aid that goes in but doesn't actually produce results, where local people aren't really listened to. And we know that Rwandan women, suffered extreme violations during the genocide. We also know that women in the IDP camps, as we see with the storyline of Tafia, the 15-year-old who will be violated in the camps. There was a lot of violence in the camps, lack of security, which is surprising given that at the time there were still UN forces on the ground. There were lots of NGOs. I think at one point there was a count of 10,000 NGOs on the ground. And so one has to wonder, what is going on? And so I don't want to be too extreme, but I perhaps will be a little bit, which is that, we have to think of what is the corruption. So Rwandan scholars will, compel people to think about where, when we think of the way multinationals function in small countries, the degree to which they are repeating colonial tropes without realizing it, that there is a kind of dependency between what we call developing countries and the same developed countries which created their underdevelopment, and so this is something we have to think about. What I like to tell people, because what happened last summer after the last earthquake, where over 2,000 people died, which is actually a significant number given modern earthquakes, is that to really look at organizations like yours that have been doing good work on the ground in partnership with local organizations and local actors, and have been doing so over time, that understand what's happening on the ground, are responsible to the people that they are working with, and are doing so in a way that they're not simply advancing their own agenda, their own profile, but what it is that needs to happen on the ground, so that they're using their privilege at the service of those who need those privilege, who don't have access to that privilege. And so, on my website, I do have a list of NGOs that I support, and I will add, if I have not already, I will certainly add Rayjon. And I think that you have to do your due diligence. You have to look at the organizations, and whether one of the key things is whether they have low overheads and put in more resources on the ground than in their infrastructures. And then how long they've been operating and with whom they've been operating, and whether the people that they've been assisting can actually speak to the results on the ground. So most really good NGOs publish their accounting, and they also publish testimonials from the people that they've been assisting. And so there's a transparency that you need to look for. And sometimes it's not the best to give to the biggest organizations. There are some great big organizations like Partners in Health, but sometimes it's good to look at something smaller rather than the large NGOs. For example, a lot of people gave to the American Red Cross, which dispersed very little money in Haiti, but took in a lot, like millions.
Right. Yeah. I think you're very much speaking to, this localized approach, which for sure is something that Rayjon really cares about. And we actually have a question from the audience about that. Lindsay is wondering, do you see at this time or over time since the earthquake, are you seeing the shift in the consideration of specific needs and voices of the Haitian people themselves?
I would say yes and no. So after, I would say, a 4 to 5 year period, a lot of NGOs left. Some of that is good because they weren't necessarily really helping people. It was a kind of opportunistic, landing in a catastrophe zone and exploiting, the local population and scene, but those who remained and those who were always there continued their best practices, or in the case of the women's organizations, regrouped, elected new representatives and continued their rebuilding of their work. There are a lot of positive things going on the ground. There's an organization out of Haiti called Focal, which I would have people look at, which is mostly cultural, but they also build libraries. They also assist young people going to university locally and abroad, finding work when they come back to Haiti. There's a lot going on the ground that is very positive, but the real problem is that there are a lot of roadblocks, and some of them are international. So for example, just recently there were women-led protests in the streets to raise the minimum wage, but the attempt to raise the minimum wage, which is currently $4 an hour, by the way, in factories, I think US dollars, has been going on since the late 80s. And in 2004, it was one of the reasons that the then president was actually removed from office by foreign powers, US and France. There were other reasons, but this was one of the reasons. And so if one of the things that I like to tell people is that if they want to help smaller countries, like Haiti, the DR, elsewhere, and the issues have to do with migrant issues and statelessness, they need to be more involved in understanding how foreign policy works between their own country and these smaller countries that they might have some interest in assisting. So you have to understand how Canadian foreign policy works, how US foreign policy works. And if you're somebody who's active politically, we should all be to some degree, talk to your locally elected political officials and tell them that you're concerned about foreign policy and what is happening. And then if there's nothing that can be done on that level, then that's where you look for the NGOs that are doing work in the areas that you care about, and you support them as much as you can and let other people know about them on social media, personally, et cetera.
Well, folks, we are nearing the end of our time. I'm going to have two final questions for Myriam. This has been a fabulous evening. We wish we could go on, continue hearing from her. So Myriam, tonight you've been sharing with us, suffering and despair on one hand, but also hope or strength, but also vulnerability. So when you think about Haiti today and you see everything that's happening there currently, are there things that make you despair, and what are the things that give you hope?
Oh, this is something I ask myself all the time, actually, but thank you for that question. Well, on the one hand, I feel some despair, in the sense that my mother, to whom the novel is also dedicated, passed away in 2019. And I had hoped that we could return to Haiti, that she could see Haiti before she passed away. And that was not to pass, both because she was ill, but because of the conditions in the country, the political unrest. And now things have gotten even worse than in 2019. And so there is a moment as a Haitian where you think, how much more duress and oppression can a people, suffer? It's really, for me, hard to understand. And I know intellectually, I've written about it, and I know intellectually that there are political reasons for all of this. But it's very, very hard to wrap one's mind around the suffering of people that seems constant. So on the one hand, I feel like, well, I don't know when I'll ever go home again. So I did keep going back after the earthquake, but then I stopped at a certain point. What gives me hope, and maybe this will come back to Christopher's question earlier, is art as a political arm in a certain way, because I've followed and I'm very much a supporter of Haitian artists. There's a small women's group that I've supported for a couple of decades now, it seems. It's before the earthquake, in La Gonave, where they make these beautiful scarves that tell the story of Haitian fauna, Haitian beliefs. And you can find this kind of art all over the country. And they're often organized in what's called combits. So the La Gonave group, it's called Art Matenois. You can find them online. They, share all the proceeds of their sales, and it goes back into the collective, and it goes back into the community. And a lot of small organizations throughout the country work in this kind of way, in this idea of the collective and a kind of democratic outcome. So I have a very strong belief in the local population and their efforts to continue, and so much of it is revealed through their art.
I love that you mentioned the Haitian art. For our last question coming from the audience, because we've been seeing your lovely face, but also right behind you, we
Ah,
see your
yes,
book and this hummingbird. So
that's
Cheryl would
right.
like to know, can you tell us a little bit more about the title and the cover with the hummingbird?
Absolutely. So originally the title was actually Douze, because in Haiti, people refer to the earthquake by its date, which was January 12th of 2010. They'll just say Douze. But as we got closer to publishing, my editor's marketing, for both the presses this book was published with said, well, this might work in Canada where there are, Francophone people, might not work in the United States, because I was using the numerical 12. And so, 12 might not resonate as douze for some people. And so we searched then for a new title. And What Storm, What Thunder came from the epigraph, the Frederick Douglass epigraph, which is from his essay on what to the slave is the 4th of July. And at the time, he was talking about the liberation of people who were enslaved in the United States, African Americans enslaved, and what it would take for true liberation to occur. So he said thunder, the earthquake, basically a big storm. And then in Didier's section, he's reading from Revelation in the King James Bible. And in Revelation, there's also reference to a capital collapsing because of thunder and earthquake. And then we also found that two of the characters in Sonia's section, Sonia talks about Dieudonné having a premonition of something occurring, and that he could smell it in the air like thunder before it occurs. And so What Storm, What Thunder is both a question and a statement, what has come to pass, and something quiet, but that also would invoke, the catastrophe without being directly about it. And then the hummingbirds on the novel. So Diane Chonette of Tin House, which is the American publisher, did the artwork for this, and she was looking for some passage. I know we're over time. Do I have time to read the reference to the hummingbirds?
Go right ahead. Please
Okay. So this is in Tafia's section. So Diane basically told me, I read the novel and I was looking for something organic, that would give this sense of both hope and, despair. And she came across these few lines in Tafia's section. And this is after, just as the earthquake is happening. So she says, people who had been laughing and fighting 1 second were reduced to lifelessness, their bodies tossed by the side of the road until a truck could pick them up and take them away later, much later. The sound covered us all like vibrating wings of some giant hummingbird. In school, I had learned that hummingbirds could beat their wings 70 times per second. The sound from my own throat joined in the hum. Didi, her brother, would have called it Armageddon, the battle for souls at the end times in the Bible. And so she got that reference to the hummingbirds. And I live in Southern California, so we get a lot of hummingbirds. But if you've ever been in a place with hummingbirds that come zip by you, at first it sounds like a helicopter, and sometimes it sounds like something was going off. And so it was that idea, because a lot of Haitians who were in Port-au-Prince at the time of the earthquake will compare notes on what they thought they heard, which is something that recurs through the novel. People have different sounds. But the hummingbird was something that was both quiet and very powerful. And then when she decided to work on this, she then looked for representations of a hummingbird. And these are based on the hummingbirds painted by Audubon, James Audubon. And most people don't know this, but James Audubon was actually born in Saint-Domingue before it became Haiti. And so this is what she found, and that there was a tie into Haiti that a lot of people might not realize.
I didn't know that connection. Wow, what a fabulous image. Dr. Myriam Chancy, merci un peu. We want to say thank you so much. This is one thing I hate about the Zoom era, is that you can't really do a standing ovation, but I'm sure that our audience would be doing that right now. Thank you from all of us at Rayjon and our partners, Sarnia-Lambton Alliance Against Hate and the Bookkeeper. That was absolutely fabulous. You've given us so much to continue thinking about, and I hope everyone goes out and now gets your other books very fast.
Thank you.
I also want to thank the audience for joining us. fabulous presentation. If you enjoyed our conversation this evening, please know that we have another conversation to share with the public coming on April 12th. You're invited to check out our next podcast episode, where we'll be talking about that localized approach in direct conversation with some of our partners in the Dominican as they work to resolve complex problems at the community level. So that's coming out on April 12th. You can find it wherever podcasts are found, or of course on our website. Please watch your emails. We will send you all of the links that have been shared for further reading and resources tonight. And thank you everyone for joining us. Take care. Have a wonderful evening.